Okay, let's get started. Good morning and welcome to our webinar this afternoon, exploring co-housing and the lessons learned from our award-winning Marmalade Lane scheme in Cambridge. My name's Charlotte Burton and I'm a planner at the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service and also Vice Chair of the RTPI East of England Regional Activities Committee and Management Board. And we organise CPD and APC training events and networking for our planners across the East of England region. And if you're not already involved in the regional RTPI, then please do have a look at our programme events coming up on our website. So we're delighted today to be joined by RTPI President Sue Mans on the second of her virtual visits to the region. She has already visited South Essex on strategic planning, and if you missed it, that's now available to view on the RTPI's YouTube channel. And we hope that Sue will enjoy another flavour from the East of England region, albeit virtually, this year. The third and final event in our series of virtual President's Visits is looking at the Gull Wing project in Lowestoft, which is a nationally significant infrastructure project, which I hear is at a very exciting stage in its development. And that's going to be on next Monday, the 2nd of November. So please do sign up for that. So back to today. We're looking at co-housing at Marmalade Lane, which was crowned the overall winner at this year's RTPI Awards for Planning Excellence. And in presenting the cup, the judges recognised the value of community-led housing and the collaborative approach to planning. And we were thrilled that a project from our region took the top prize, and we couldn't miss an opportunity to share with you some of the lessons learned and to showcase the scheme to as many people as possible. So we have an excellent panel for you today from everybody that's been involved in the project, and we're going to be exploring it from a range of perspectives. So the project began in the aftermath of the financial crash in 2008-9 and involved the landowner Cambridge City Council working with members of the K1 co-housing group alongside developer Town and with the local planning authority South Cambridgeshire District Council, with members of the group first moving in December 2018. And we have 4 speakers. We're going to be led off by Meredith from Mole Architects, who will introduce the scheme, followed on by Trovine Monteiro, who will give the local planning authority perspective and a history of the site from its inception through to planning. And he'll hand over to Neil Murphy from the developer perspective, who will finally hand on to Francis Wright, who is involved from the perspective of a resident community member. So our presentations will last approximately 30 minutes and we'll have an opportunity to take questions. So all attendee microphones have been muted, but please put your questions in the chat box and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. And I'm joined today by my colleague on the committee, Sophie Payne, who will be fielding the questions to our speaker. And it may not be possible to take all of the questions, so apologies in advance if we don't make it to your question. I'll then invite Sue to give us some reflections. I know she's very excited about this scheme and looking forward to hearing more. If you do drop out from the session at any time, please do just rejoin using the original link. Otherwise, a recording will be available on the RTPI's YouTube channel, so you can watch any bits that you've missed or rewatch it as many times as you'd like. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Meredith Bowles. Meredith.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Now, let's, can you confirm you're seeing my screen or not? Charlotte, you have to put your microphone on if I can hear you.
Lovely, we can see you. Thank you, Meredith.
Oh, you've got my screen. Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Charlotte. As you've just described, actually there was quite a large and complex background to this project with a number of players from start to finish, and it had a long gestation period actually. Some years before, when the K1 housing group were looking for land, and finally Cambridge City Council found a plot of land that they wanted to assist with. So they were the land owners and had a competition for a developer to develop housing for K1. So it's an unusual and interesting background, and perhaps that's the reason why it happened at all. So you can see the Marmalade Lane in the foreground there, looking back towards the centre of Cambridge. The straight line on the left-hand side is the guided bus, and you can just see at the bottom of the page the A14, which goes across the north side of Cambridge. This was the group that we started working with. So they'd worked for a year before. Francis will tell you more about how they worked with the design. But they were very, very active participants in the process. So by the time we came along as architects and developers, they had already produced quite a significant brief and an initial scheme that we were then asked as a development team to pitch for. And if those of you that don't know the principles of co-housing, it's sometimes known as intentional communities. So people that are coming together to make a place for themselves. And the essential ingredients are some shared space, typically a common ground and common house in the centre, and a car-free development. And that's the from the south side, looking back at the built project, which, as you can see, more or less maps that kind of diagrammatic version of what co-housing is. Shared space that everyone looks onto. In this instance, also there's the eponymous Marmalade Lane, which goes across at the top of the site. And on the right-hand side there, you can see a number of house types that, as part of the competition, we devised a series of house types that could be arranged in a terrace, producing an extremely wide range of house sizes that people could then buy, because obviously there were 40 odd houses and initially 40 different specifications. So to put that into something which was commercially viable meant a degree of standardization. And at the center is the common house, which is owned by everyone. On the right hand side, you can see the apartments, and beyond that, the car parking. So as a piece of urban townscape, it faces outwards as well as inwards. The houses have a fairly conventional relationship to the street, and Trovine will tell you a bit more about the planning background to that in a minute. In front of each of the houses, there's you can see the enclosures for the air source heat pump, which divides the front gardens up. And at the entrances at each, there's 3 entrances, and at each one there are communal bike parking and communal bin stores. Again, something that's unusual for houses as opposed to a flatted development. And that's a view down Marmalade Lane, which is available for use by transport. So if there's emergency vehicles or a need for transport that can be used, there's car parking spaces there if necessary, but the group was always sure that they would use less spaces than were required by planning, and that has indeed been the case. So the main street through the development is really taken over by children rather than by cars. And at the centre is the common ground or common garden. There was existing, we were blessed with fantastic mature trees running across the centre of the site. And this is early days. The community is going to make a lot of these shared spaces. At the foreground, you can just see some productive gardening happening, and beyond there is actually part of the SUDS design for drainage, but will become a wildflower garden. The scale of the development is very closely linked to the quality of Cambridge streets. Cambridge is a relatively low town with 2 to 3 stories, sometimes going up to 4. So it's a combination of the simple and predominantly terraced streets, and looking at the kind of sense of uniqueness in them, which led to the different colours within the scheme. And at the same time, we took inspiration from countries that have a greater history of communal space and communal living, and a slightly different attitude towards privacy. So these are both schemes in Copenhagen. A Victorian one that was taken over in the 60s by a group for communal living, taking control and ownership of the street. And on the right-hand side, a recent development on the outskirts of Copenhagen, where the cars are dealt with elsewhere, meaning that the entrances to the houses were pedestrian only. Francis will tell you a bit more later on about the engagement of the co-housing group during the co-design process, but that's a really important part of why the scheme was successful. We work very closely with a series of groups. They were exceptionally well organized, I have to say, which meant that potentially a really protracted and difficult design process was actually very effective. But the level of engagement of the community during the design has meant that the degree of ownership they feel of the properties is really significantly different to any other scheme that we've worked on. So that's the, that's the garden space at the rear. You can see that everyone does have their own private garden space, but it's not enclosed by high fences. It gives straight onto the shared spaces, and that's the same whether it's looking onto the shared street or the shared garden. So the degree of privacy actually will change, we're sure, over time. So people will decide what to do in terms of enclosing their gardens with planting or fences. And there will be, I'm sure, a greater and a lesser extent of that, depending on people's attitudes towards privacy. But what it's essentially has meant is that the way in which space is occupied is fundamentally different to most streets, because there's a greater sense of belonging, a greater sense of knowing your neighbours, and a degree of passive security that is unusual, I think. So, I think the scheme offers a different way of thinking about living through the way in which it's been both procured and designed. So you'll hear a lot more from the others in terms of the process. I'm now going to hand you on to Trovine, if I can make the technology work, who's going to tell you a bit about the planning background.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Charlotte?
I think you can. Yes.
Hi, my name is Trovine Monteiro. I lead the urban design team at Greater Cambridge Shared Planning, which is the two planning services of South Cambs and Cambridge City that's come together. And I would like to thank RTPI for giving me this opportunity to present today, as I believe that this project can only be understood through the lens of the various stakeholders that are involved in it, including the community, the public sector, and the design and delivery partners. This slide really shows, to the right-hand side, the parcel K1. It's located in the northern part of the city on the Cambridge Northern Fringe, and was part of the Arbury Camp Master Plan. The site was owned by Cambridge City Council, as you've heard, and the master plan was for around 900 homes. The master plan was developed by John Thompson and Partners, and it received outline consent in about 2005. And it typically worked along a perimeter block structure. And as part of that master plan, it had a vision and a guidance document, which is shown on the slide on the left, that suggests how the parcels would be developed. Pretty much a typical volume house building layout that puts buildings or residential dwellings towards the periphery of the site, with parking in the center. At the same time, this was during the 2008 recession, that it was very difficult to sell the plots. Negotiations between the landowner, Cambridge City Councils, and the developers failed. And so these sites were put forward, or at least a feasibility study was intended to be put forward by Cambridge City Council jointly with South Cambridgeshire District Council to see what kind of development could be developed on the site. So Cambridge City Council commissioned C20 future planners to conduct a feasibility study for self-build on this site and see what was the best model for self-build. At the same time, they also commissioned Instinctively Green through Adam Broadway to project manage and find a group that could start engaging with the project brief, and at the same time also commissioned Cambridge Architectural Research to develop a viability model to develop a brief in terms with the community of how this project could move forward. Now, whilst this was happening, and due to the recession and also the implications of the first few stages of the Orchard Park master plan, the council grew slightly concerned on the level of quality that was being delivered on this site, and also produced its own guidance, which is on the left-hand side of this document, which takes on the principles from the Arbery design guide, on the same principles of a perimeter block form with parking in the center, overlooking the edges. Now, this principle was in direct conflict, in effect, with the co-housing concept, as you can see on the right, which Meredith talked about, which is based around the common house and buildings along the edge of it with parking towards the periphery. And car
Trovine, it's Charlotte here. I'm sorry, we can't hear you at the moment. Can we get your sound back? Yep, we can hear you again now. Thank you.
Can you hear? Okay. Sorry, I'll probably put the microphone close to my mouthpiece, close to my mouth.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and it developed this perimeter block form that had the lane running in the center. It had the communal garden in the middle, and the community building. You can see further the 4-story element that's facing the lane. But what happened was the implications of car parking provision, which was one of the big concerns within the Orchard Park development, meant that there was a requirement for the cars to be, the car parking requirement to be placed on the site. And that meant that because of the concept, it had to be positioned towards the periphery, which took a lot of the top road, as you can see to the north, and the Star End Road occupied by cars. The images on the left kind of shows you the interaction between the buildings and the street, and this was one of the key concerns that the local authority had with the proposals at this stage. Following the outline consent, which was given on the previous plan that you've seen, the local authorities and Cambridge City together decided to have a workshop and also a procurement exercise to work with a development partner to ensure that the issues that were in this plan, as you can see, were resolved. And that's what the plan we've achieved on the site, which meant that the Topper Street had now buildings that were fronting onto it, but it also meant that this required a different way to envision the block, not your typical front and back gardens, but this was possible because the type of community that was living in that wanted to interact with one another, the street forms the place, the Marmalade Lane street forms the place of interaction. And the gardens become semi-private gardens in effect. You can see the community building facing the communal green space and the parking located in area F towards the eastern end. Now, the requirement for parking was also reduced with a condition and a Section 106 agreement to ensure that the number of parking was always monitored by the residents. And this was one of the key issues that we needed to overcome to ensure that the community which wanted to live very sustainably had to pass through the hurdle of the parking policy in the local plan, which stated a particular requirement that they needed to achieve. And so that hurdle was overcome through the condition in Section 106 agreement. The result was that you've got these buildings that face onto Topper Street, which is much positive and welcomed through the engagement of town and mall architects. The other aspects also in terms of lessons learned was the material treatment, which initially was suggested that could be dealt with by the community themselves as long as the palette was approved. And you can see that there's a slight subtle difference in palette, and it really doesn't matter where and how the palette is applied, but the buildings do work well together. This is the communal space that's within the development as it's growing up.
Trovine, just to interrupt. Yep, 1 minute more.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. And the final thing to say really is with regard to working with the community. It's useful. This is a slide I picked up from the Marmalade Lane community, and Francis and Town will say more. It gives us much more dividends when you design together for the future right from the start. And a lot of the issues that we've overcome over the years could be, the time for those could be compressed as we work together moving forward. Thanks. Now I'll hand over to Town to carry out their presentation.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Excellent. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Neil Murphy, one of the two founding directors of Town, and I'd like to give kind of our perspective as the enabling developer, really. Kind of new role, really, for developers, and it's the one that I think we've always been quite keen on. I mean, development's only really two things: it's skills and money, and often a lot of emphasis is placed on the money and not on the skills. I think that what this project shows is that there are different ways of doing development that are, that are potentially much more in line with the kind of social and environmental outcomes that we all want, and very relevant at a time when no doubt people are cramming their responses to the planning white paper. I want to pick out four things that I think were interesting and different from a developer's perspective about this. The first is procurement, which has been touched on. One of probably the single biggest question that we picked up since the scheme finished was how did the procurement process work to get the outcomes that were wanted? Yeah, a relatively unusual project, an SME developer, the use of modern methods of construction, and the aspects of design that are very different from what you might normally do. And I think that there are kind of three elements to it, really. It was a very well-designed procurement process. It went through two stages. The first stage asked basically nothing about the kind of the financial capabilities of the developer or the price that would be offered for the land. It was entirely about approach, philosophy, and quality, and that meant that the group was able to take a view on the developers they were willing to work with, who they thought understood the vision and the brief, without it really being a kind of financial test. And then at stage two, there was a lot more design development required, but also it brought in the issue of land price. So there was a competitive element, and crucially, the city council as the vendor could show that it was meeting it was getting the best reasonable consideration for its land, given the objectives that it had set in the brief. And I think that too many public bodies, local authorities in particular, sort of not so much hide behind, but don't really apply in a sophisticated way their obligations around best consideration when they're thinking about using their assets to deliver better development and create exemplars. The minimum land price was set below the open market valuation of the scheme at the time, in recognition that that some of the complexities might drive the land value down. But I think in practice, what was eventually paid probably wasn't a million miles off what the open market value would have been. The developer got certain obligations, which were to follow the client brief. We had to assume the construction and sales risk, as any developer normally would, and we had to provide a meaningful collaborative design process, which I'll come on to. And in return, we were offered certain things that really helped the project along. The first was deferred payment terms for the land, so we didn't have to carry the cash flow cost of buying the land on our balance sheet. It was able to be paid down from sales. And there had, as Trovine has already outlined, been some prior planning de-risking, which was useful. So this was the process we followed. In fact, Town was in joint venture with Trovine, who were the principal funder, but also the supplier of one of the modern methods of construction that I'll show you in a minute. But we very much led the bid process, the design process up to planning, and Trovine came more to the fore when we were building the scheme out. This was the process we followed. We went from winning the bid to submitting a full planning application in about 5 months, which is pretty good going under any circumstances. Clearly a lot owed to the work that had been done beforehand, but also I think to a really good, well-run process whereby ourselves, the professional team, and members work together intensively to explore the key design and specification elements and produce resolved proposals. And those worked across essentially 5 work streams: environmental performance, the design of the common house, the design of homes, including the customization process, the design of outdoor space, and then 2 sort of non-design elements that were nonetheless critical. One was the purchase process, and the process by which members could commit and reserve themselves a home and get certain discounts for their early commitment and so forth, and then a wider sort of sales, marketing, and outreach designed at really finding buyers for the remaining units. And we would tend to have sort of normal design team meetings about every 2 weeks, and then interspersed with those, often in evenings, would be meetings with the group to look thematically at some of the issues feeding in. The third thing I want to highlight, I think, is the kind of design opportunity that came from the brief. There was an element here of challenging the agents and to a certain extent the planning authority's view of what people want, particularly around parking, which I'm going to come on to in a minute. Some of the elements of good placemaking that Meredith outlined really did come from breaking rules. I think this is very relevant at the moment when design coding is very in vogue. I mean, the design code that was written for and the design guidance adopted through a supplementary planning document for Orchard Park was pretty good, but it showed what happened when that collides with the kind of volume house builder business model that kind of is determined to break it as far as it can, and I think really showed the limits, particularly of guidance-based as opposed to rules-based coding. The involvement of future residents really encouraged creative solutions, particularly around things like energy. And there was a constant iteration between the brief, the appraisal, financial appraisal, the team, and the group, so that we could tackle trade-offs that inevitably needed to be made between what the brief asked for or ideas people had, and then the budget. One example I want to dwell on is particularly around cars and parking. I think one of the things that Marmalade Lane and subsequent projects we've worked on has taught us is that, really the amount of parking you have to provide and the way that you have to provide it really does determine whether a scheme can be any good or not. And the vast majority of local authorities up and down the country have policies on parking that essentially makes it possible to achieve good residential environments. Marmalade Lane's on the right, showing the area reserved for parking. On the left is the opposite block, which follows the code, provides 2.5 parking spaces per dwelling, and the area circled in red is the area that is wholly or primarily for the circulation of and storage of vehicles. And you can see really what the trade-offs are around usable amenity space. And there are the figures. 38% of space in the adjacent plot used for the movement and storage of vehicles, 12% in Marmalade Lane, leaving a huge amount for landscape. And you know, that's still one space per dwelling plus visitor spaces, which really in a connected place like Cambridge ought to be very much improvable on. Second key design opportunity I want to highlight was modern methods of construction. Clearly, the brief gave us an opportunity here around the thermal standards that the group wanted, and working with the Swedish house builder Trovine meant we were always going to use the system on the left, the closed timber panel system, to build houses. It achieves sort of about 2/3 of the way between building regulations and passive house in terms of passive thermal performance. But also for the apartment building, we decided in the end that it would work better from cross-laminated timber, so we had not one but two forms of MMC, and we were able to make some quite good comparisons between the speed and the performance and the cost of those, both of which performed pretty well, and we'll be following similar approaches on future projects. And the last point I really want to make is, you know, it's customer satisfaction. I mean, all developers should care about how their projects work and how their customers feel. I'm not sure they always do. I think one of the lovely things was we got constant feedback from people about how they were feeling. Being involved, you know, contributed directly, I think, to people's sense of satisfaction, and, you know, gave them a higher degree of patience with the things that invariably happen, where you've got snags to sort out and things like that when a development is first occupied. But I think we're particularly taken with the way that the kids who live there have received it, and the way that the development really has been more than any of us could have imagined as a place for kind of nature play and for kids to really you know, thrive in that environment. And on that note, I will pass on to Francis to talk a bit about what it's like to live there.
Unmuted, and just got my webcam going. Right, thank you. So I live in Marmalade Lane, and I was involved with the co-housing group probably just before town was selected, and I now work with town. And it falls to me to wrap up before questions, so I'm going to need to take it fairly fast, because I know we've run over. So I'm taking the opportunity to describe what it's like to live in co-housing and bring it right up to date, and therefore I've got to touch on what it's like to live in co-housing, a place designed for social interaction when you're living through a pandemic. So these are recent photos I've taken, and I hope they show how some of the shared spaces have evolved in response to the needs and interests of those people now living here. And my co-presenters have shown how the site evolved from the master plan through this collaborative design process, and these pictures hopefully will give you a sense of the place now in use and how it's still evolving. So living here, it is possible to have as much company as I wish and to be as active and busy as I wish without really needing to plan that or put much effort into making it happen. Social isolation is not a phenomenon easy to pursue in co-housing, but one of the benefits of co-housing I hadn't really anticipated is the opportunity it provides for people to make a social contribution in ways that make sense to them, with support from others in the community. And these next few slides illustrate that. So this is one of my neighbours who loves to paint, and her dream was mural painting. And she, with the support of others living here, with permission, have spent the summer painting a mural of local wildlife and plants on the hoardings of the development site opposite us. And on the right is one of my neighbours who loves to cook and was enjoying cooking for the large numbers involved with regular weekly community meals. Missed doing that during COVID, and so she started to offer lunches for collection on Tuesdays to people living within the community. And then if I move on, this is a slide, that's the interior of our plant room, and for the second year running we're looking after hedgehogs who need help over the winter. And there are a team of 4 residents here who are currently looking after 7 hedgehogs. And last spring, the local primary school brought classes here to see the hedgehogs. And people in Orchard Park continue to support the initiative by bringing in hedgehogs, food and newspapers. for their bedding. And then on the right is a summer initiative. Through the summer, a number of my neighbours built a wooden chicken coop from scratch, and when it was finished, we put our name down for rescue hens. They arrived almost featherless, but they're now clearly fully feathered up, lost that initial reserve, and are enjoying the space and the variety of food treats being brought to them. And if I go on to the next slide, it would be really easy in co-housing to become very inward focused, and we're aware of that, and we make a lot of effort to make sure that we're part of our local community and are contributing and giving something back. And we hold a monthly rubbish ramble, and in the summer we organised a community event over a weekend to clear up the rubbish that had been abandoned in a local footpath. And then, as I said, we really can't touch on co-housing without touching on COVID. And supporting each other emotionally and practically, sharing food deliveries, communicating about suspected symptoms, tests, outcomes, sharing information. That was really straightforward. What has it's always been easy to navigate, though, the differing opinions about how to respond to the challenges. The social life has continued, mainly outside and sometimes online or with a combination. And these images are all about the process of adapting the space to COVID. So on the left is the long room, a 10 by 2 metre windowless room, used partly for storage, but when lockdown started and the shelves emptied, it became a community shop. And on the right, once children came home from school, and many people were working from home as well, the common house became a place for people to homework if they needed to escape. And outdoors has been really critical, so community meals pretty much slowed down, became less frequent, but we adapted the lane, so it now has much more of a sort of piazza feel with these cable drums and tables, so that we could continue to eat, albeit outside. And then co-housing involves lots of cake, and here is a birthday celebration, but now outside with a pop-up gazebo for shade and rain. And then this slide is the last one, and it's an image of just next to the entrance to the apartments and the common house is a sort of covered portico area. It's now a cosy, sheltered seating area. Outside, with winter approaching, there are now blankets tucked away and a light that can be brought out for the winter nights. And during the summer, we had a pop-up film night, which was a regular feature. That's recently migrated indoors after risk assessment with small numbers, masks and ventilation. So I hope that's given you a really good insight to what it's like living here and how it's developed through these last few months. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances, and to all our speakers. I think, Frances, your last presentation there just around living in the scheme during a pandemic probably means that the scheme has come into its own in ways that people could probably never really imagine. And it's interesting to hear how you've been able to adapt some of the spaces to be used more flexibly in ways that you probably hadn't expected. So, for example, those outdoor spaces. I wonder whether there's a reflection about how you might take those lessons forward into another scheme. Do you see that perhaps some of those spaces could have been imagined differently, or do you think they kind of suit the purpose?
I think one of the things I've learned really is the value of purposeless space, and it's okay to have a space that doesn't have a purpose. It will find its purpose and it will keep reinventing itself as people's interests and needs change. And I think the long room, which started originally as a canoe room, is a really good example of that transition. and I fully expect to have photos of something entirely different in it in a few years' time. So I think, yes, be brave. Space, any space is useful. It doesn't have to have a purpose.
Yes, yeah. If I may, my reflections really are around community involvement, and I'm interested in the really early stages of the community getting involved, and how members of the community came forward, how a group was mobilised. I'd be interested to hear more about that stage, and then also from a professional point of view, as a planner, I'm wondering whether some of our other panelists have got some comments on ways in which they may have had to adapt the way they work to work with members of the community and give them that level of involvement.
So perhaps I can just start by just saying this is a really unusual co-housing community in that it starts with the land and not with the group. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that. But obviously in this context, it meant the group had to form, as you're indicating. And it isn't the stage I was involved in. I come a bit further along the journey. But I think there were promotional activities to find those initial people and then support them to develop the group. And the group grew, and it kept evolving and it kept churning as the development took time. But I'm not sure it's that difficult. I don't think one needs to worry if you've got the land and not the group. I think the group can come.
You'll find people, they'll come out.
Yes.
Trovine and Meredith and Neil, do you have any reflections on the ways in which you had to change the way that you worked at all?
Well, from an architect's perspective, in 25 years, we've done lots and lots of houses for individuals. And so to a certain extent, we came to commercial development from a background of expecting to work with people who wanted to have their houses in a particular way. And it was more of a surprise when we started working on commercial projects where there was no one to talk to, and that felt like it disabled us to a certain extent. So, you know, it was familiar to us to have people with demands and expectations and anxieties and all those things that people thinking about doing a really major project bring with them. And you know, I think the more that developers and house builders have to deal with that, the more likely we are to have houses that people really want.
Yeah, I kind of, another take on that, I think, is that, I mean, the role of the developer in all these things is always to be sort of the abominable no man on cost and, you know, planning and things. And I think that one of the things we found really kind of helpful, if a bit scary at times, was the way that, if you like, kind of planning norms and written policies and what the group wanted and what we kind of wanted for the group, because we knew the outcomes they wanted, you know, really were at odds at times. And so, you know, you win some, you lose some. So, I mean, I've mentioned parking. I think there was a good outcome there. From our point of view, that we now use that to beat everybody that we do other projects with over the head, to point out what happens when you allow basically space for people to kind of come in place of space for cars, including in non-co-housing contexts. But then there are other areas, and you know, to be fair to everyone involved with the planning of it, that, you know, that took some bravery, because everybody knows that sort of parking is a third rail that you don't touch. But then on the other hand, we then had the kind of custom build element where we wanted almost a fairly kind of like slightly anarchic approach, whereby from 4 brick types, we were pretty much going to go, just let people pick the ones they wanted. And to be fair to the planners, they kind of went, look, you know, we can't have just kind of people pleasing themselves at a later date. So, you know, we had to make a compromise there between the people who could choose early on and the ones that we filled in. But, you know, with hindsight, did it make a whole lot of difference? Not really. It was a nice to have. I think actually what it shows in some ways is that when you work really hard within the system works fine. It's not, you know, it's just, you've got to be motivated.
Yeah, I mean, my take on it is that, you know, the way you design schemes for volume house building versus for an end client are so very different. And, you know, I totally agree with Meredith's point. It's always good to have the end user in mind and the requirements of that, because that sets a more clearer outcome in terms of what you expect the place to be. And because we are so varied and different in our views and thoughts and the way we want to live, that actually creates places that are very, very, very different. And I guess the planning system around the volume house building industry is becoming more standardized in terms of how we want to deliver homes. And it sets around quite a standardized way of living, a standardized way of using your garden, of using a car, etc. So I guess there are quite a few lessons here to learn, I think, in terms of the future, in terms of the model that we use for future design codes and guides, and the flexibility that needs to be built in the system if we're going to use co-housing as a way forward, or some kind of self-build, and expand on that to be a little bit more flexible in the way we code for and design for these from a planning perspective.
Okay, thank you. So we've had a number of questions come in. I'm going to hand to Sophie to take some questions from our audience. Sophie.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, we've got quite a few questions here, so I think we'll go through these and in the next 10 minutes or so, and see how many we can make our way through before passing to the President for closing comments on this really interesting session this afternoon. So to the panel, we've got, first question is, any advice that you may have for local planning authorities on supporting prospective co-housing schemes? I guess that's clearly obviously from inception through the planning process. So any key thoughts there from the team?
Make it obligatory. So there's already the principle that's enshrined in the NPPF, which suggests that local authorities or developments over a certain size should make provision for self-build groups. And I think loads of developers are wondering how to deal with that. But actually, if the local authorities took a more proactive view and instigated something, and as Neil said, there's a massive help that can be given in terms of thinking about the process of purchase and payments, then that would make it much easier. So a lot of co-housing groups are not without capital, but it's tied up in existing properties, so they can't immediately fund it, but they've got the money. And I think there's thinking inventively about imposing something so it will happen is how local authorities could intervene.
I'd echo that, Meredith. I mean, I think that most local authorities have land assets and things. Often there's a tension between using them to promote policy goals and using them to generate capital that can be redeployed elsewhere. And I know those tensions are real. But I mean, the reality is that co-housing is only one form of differentiated provision. It's a really good one, but actually, if you looked at, say, the Netherlands, and the way that the level of self-provision there is so much higher. People just form building groups, they can access land, things like that. There's a whole spectrum out there, and the worry I have is that we sort of get this idea that on the one hand you have basically volume house building, and then on the other you have kind of really niche community-led projects with nothing in the middle. I mean, time and again we see research like the Reba case for space work from a few years ago that found that something like 2/3 of people would only buy a new home by a volume house builder as a last resort. So why do we have a system that really acts as though these kind of boring boxes with 2 parking spaces and and everything private, nothing public is somehow what people want? That people can only choose between the alternatives they're given, and if it's volume housing or co-housing, then to me that's not rich enough. So I think it's not just co-housing. I think local authorities should be looking to lever their land assets to really diversify the market across the piece.
And my take on it is, although we have the NPPF kind of promoting self-build, and we have policies even in the Greater Cambridge or South Cambridgeshire local plan promoting self-build, I think there's still a caveat in there that allows volume house builders to actually not do that if within a 12-month period they don't get enough take-up. And I think the reason why Marmalade Lane, was successful was that startup funding, to mobilize a group to do the background study in terms of, viability, the mortgages, to ensure that we have the right development partner and the developer who understands this model. And I think there needs to be a little bit, at least in the startup stages of projects, this kind of capacity building or funding and resource in terms of local authority to make sure they can connect landowners, or volume house builders who want to build with people who want to live in a co-housing self-build model. And I think that at the moment is slightly the gap that is there that needs to be filled.
Thank you. I think probably next there's a couple of questions that come together really to do with the ownership of the properties as well, and understanding a little bit more about what the ownership is. Are we looking here at freehold, long leasehold, shared ownership here? And also, are there any restrictions to ensure that they remain with the community so they can't be rented out, for example? Not too sure who's best to go to for that one, but I'll let you fight over it.
Probably me. So co-housing group approach this ways. Here we have a combination of long leasehold titles for the apartments and freehold for the houses, but those freehold titles have very similar covenants into what you find within the leases, and the bit within it that makes it work is there is an 8-week period when someone sells their property, that during which they need to offer the property to the community, and the community has that opportunity to contact their mailing list, their waiting list, engage and see if they can find someone who really wants to be here because they really want to be in co-housing. And so that's how we keep that sense of community going, that small pause on the sales process. So I think that probably addresses most of your question.
That's helpful, thank you. Neil, I know you mentioned a lot about or not a lot, but you mentioned about obviously the car parking ratio on here as well. And someone has asked what parking ratio was used, and are you able to provide some detail regarding the Section 106 requirements in terms of managing the number of cars? And I think I'd probably add on to that. Maybe one for you, Francis, as well, is actually what the uptake of the car parking spaces is like. Is this a location, or is this a type of model where, given the location, it could be pushed even further, for example, and the parking ratio lowered again?
I'll take the first bit, and then Francis can come back on it. Yeah, there is a Section 106 provision whereby it has to be monitored and managed. As Meredith alluded to, there are some sort of ghost spaces that are, in theory, kind of planned into the lane in case there was an overflow. But also within the main kind of parking area, part of it was designed as kind of undercrossed and hard standing, and part of it was designed as effectively a kind of permeable grassed area, so that if and when the group didn't use some of the spaces because they expected not to use that many, it could slightly be kind of reclaimed for the garden. So yeah, there is a kind of monitoring clause in the 106 with some minor remediation. But I think that, to be fair, the planning authority did accept that. And this is where the power of having the people who are going to live in houses engaging through the system is pretty good, because it's pretty hard for your highways development control officer to sit there and say people want this or people want that or modern lifestyles this, when you've got people on the other side of the table going, well, we're going to be living there and we don't drive. So I think that that's a really powerful thing, and it really gives sort of some oomph behind a thing that we always point out, which is that policies always require more parking than people actually want. And again, it's built on the assumption that buyers of new build houses will always have the most cars, and I've never really seen any proper evidence to back that up. In most most urban places, you know, car ownership is at or below 1 per dwelling, and it's never, I've never understood why we allow our new places to become so sort of car dominated on such, to me, flimsy kind of evidence. Not everywhere, but in many places. Francis, sorry, go on. Well, because this is very current, isn't it? Of course.
Yes, indeed. So we have a planning application in, and it is around trying to reduce the designated car parking spaces. We're sitting at 0.7, probably just a bit below that now, and we're hoping to reduce it further. And we need to increase our cycling capacity, not our car parking capacity. That's our current priority. We do have a shared electric car that was purchased by 10 households. It's now used by 15 households. We also have a shared electric cargo trike that is hosted in Marmalade Lane in one of our bin stores, shared with the wider area, and is used by about 30 people. So all of those initiatives are helping us reduce our car ownership, and or at least make sure that we're sitting at no more than 1 per household.
That's really good to hear.
The last thing to say from the local authority perspective, I think, is the way car parking policy is actually framed around this. And I know when the Marmalade Lane scheme was going, you know, the local plan, you know, was the old local plan that we have, and currently it's a design-led parking policy approach. And I think that's what we need to kind of move towards. So there are areas that are far off and disconnected from public transport, from you know, cities, etc., where there might be a different consideration given in terms of car parking versus areas that are well connected, and also the lifestyle of people that who intends to live there, and therefore, you know, the parking policies should be towards a tailor-based approach in the circumstances and the situations where we are sites that we are dealing with, or the people we're dealing with.
Thank you for that. I think we'll probably have to leave it there for the questions, which is a shame because there's lots of really interesting questions, and I'm sure that discussion could go on for much longer, but I'm keen to give our president, Sue, the chance to give her own reflections as a closing commentary. So thank you.
Oh, wow, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you all so very much for what you did. And as I mentioned when we were having our sort of pre-chat, I was one of the Silver Jubilee Cup judges, and I'm left in absolutely no doubt that we got this spot on when Marmalade Lane were the winners. And what's been really interesting to me is actually that chance. So when you're judging, you're reading through things on paper, and you're looking at things, it's maybe it's a two-dimensional plan in essence, along with the narrative that goes with it. But what this session has done is provided an opportunity to actually experience that development from start to finish, and experience and understand how the process actually came forward from those people who were really at the chalk face on it. So thank you, that was really, really interesting. And a couple of things that I picked up, Meredith, I was particularly struck when you talked about the different sense of ownership that comes with a scheme like that. That's something that will resonate very much with me. And Trovine, I think again, linked to that, you talked about the dividends when design comes together from the absolute start. And as someone who's really passionate about community engagement, that is so important, that everyone is there from the very beginning. And then one of the sort of things that have been picked up in the questions that also really struck me was, Neil, when you talked about parking spaces, and I know we've come back to that, and I think it's a really important issue that I think as a profession we need to start to tackle. But again, what you were talking about was the trade-offs between parking and community space. And really, I think, taking Francis's point, that it's the community that actually know best about what that trade-off means in the way that life is lived. And one of the things I really wanted to ask when we were judging, but obviously you can't, and bear in mind we were judging right in early lockdown stages. So I was looking at them, through my mind was going this sort of question, well, this is all fantastic, but we're suddenly all socially distanced. We're all locked down, we're all in. How is this actually going to work? And I think you've answered that. really, really effectively, because it's a place designed for social interaction. But the biggest challenge it's actually faced is when that interaction couldn't happen in the way you thought. And the examples you gave of the way the communities actually come together to support and to repurpose space, to use it in different ways. And that evolution, that flexibility has just added strength to the social integration from what you said. And I also love the fact, and it's something I feel very strongly about, is that space doesn't always have to have a purpose, because what we identify a purpose of space for now in 2020, these developments should outlive us, they'll outlive our children, our children's children, and hopefully them as well. And spaces and the way we use them and places change. So it may not be something at this point in time, but it gives that flexibility, that adaptability. So it was absolutely fantastic. And the question, it's always like, don't ever come on with the last question, because I actually had a real question that I wanted to ask. And of course, it was the first one up. What piece of advice would you actually give to people who are doing all this? And I think, you answered that so well. So thank you so much. And I know Cambridge well, and I do come back and forwards to Cambridge. And as soon as we can travel again, please, can I come and see you?
Thank you very much, Sue. It's really lovely to hear your enthusiasm about the project. And I know that there's been a lot of commitment from everybody involved on the scheme. So thank you to all of our panelists for a really interesting and insightful session. Thank you for everybody for joining us and for your questions. The last thing for me to do is just to plug the announcement of the regional awards for planning excellence on the 19th of November. So we will have a new regional winner, and who knows, they may even go forward to win the big national award as well, and we'd be absolutely thrilled if they did. So thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.